This is AudioGyan, and I am your host Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world. In episode number 220 with Hrush Bhatt, he said, a sculptor knows his or her medium, which is say marble, mud, or a stone. An architect knows what kind of material he or she wants. Similarly, a product designer should know how to code, design, and write copy, which are the core ingredients of creating software. Today, we have a guest who's a perfect blend of understanding materials and implementing it in her practice. Sagarika Suri, a practicing architect and urban designer in Mumbai. She practices small and large-scale projects through Studio Tessera, based in Mumbai, and dabbles with materials at Rock, Paper, Scissors. It's a material lab for studio to experiment with ideas and concepts at a small scale. Sagarika is also a part of CSA, which is a collective for spatial alternatives, and has been engaged in self-development and low-cost housing projects in Mumbai. More about her in the show notes. Just a small call out, which is AudioGyan typically has three formats: AudioGyan interviews, case studies, and biographies. In case study, we generally go deep dive into one project, one problem statement, one solution. And with Sagarika, I'm hoping to cover rock, paper, scissors as a case study. So, yeah, welcome Sagarika to AudioGyan. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show, and thanks for giving your time.
Hi, Kedar. Thank you so much for that introduction and for having me on the show.
Awesome. So as I sort of had a call out, which is a case study on rock, paper, and scissors, and obviously understanding your practice and work. But mainly, I was very interested in understanding the kind of material exploration that you do, and have come up with few questions. So I'll start off with the first one, which is kind of going to set the background. Also, is to what does material mean to you? I mean, and typically, as we sort of get more experience, and the definition keeps changing or evolving with time. So yeah, if you can start there, that what does material mean to you? It could be at a philosophical level, at a tactical level, at whatever, wherever you want to start off with your understanding.
Thank you for that question, Kedar. So, I mean, material is a lot of excitement for me right now. I think with my current practice, I'm sort of rediscovering materials in a way, and I feel like I'm back in like a startup mode. So, I mean, materials is by definition tied to crafting and making, and architecture and objects, they're created from materials. And I mean, materials have like they are a profound part of the experience of buildings and objects. So for me as well, based on the type of craft that I'm engaged in, material is very much about making and crafting. However, more recently, it has taken on a sort of larger meaning, and it has become a medium to express and validate an ethos. And so more and more, I feel like a material for me cannot exist outside of a value system. So like up until recent years, we've had this kind of linear cradle to grave system, which has dominated production and consumption, where you have raw materials which are extracted and then they are transported to manufacturing units, and then they are kind of made into products, and then those products are shipped around the world, and then they are used for small durations of time and then sort of thrown away. And obviously there is a limit to the system because we are running out of natural raw materials. And this sort of linear, what we call like a make, waste culture, it's also being critiqued all around us, and a more cyclical approach is being adopted. And I feel that materials, they lie at the core of this shift. And like giving importance to materials sort of allows us to reconsider this philosophy of design from the very bottom up. And I think within this shift, a new type of practitioner is also emerging, a designer, ecologist, a social scientist of sort, a more aware practitioner who's embracing sustainability, but also looking at social and ecological interconnectedness. I mean, the buzzwords are being ecologically conscious and social equity. These, I mean, you can't ignore these in your design practice anymore. And I myself completely aspire to that kind of practice. And I feel that material has become like a very important partner in that aspiration. So I would say that, aside from the kind of physical creations that material allows us, and that there's always, of course, so much excitement in that, in those tangible objects, it's also become a primary mode, I think, for experiment and validation of that ethos. And I think at this point, material has to be chosen very correctly for me in my practice, because I feel it can have a negative impact. One of the materials that I've been working closely with and in great detail is waste plywood that's come out of my own architecture and interior design practices, and it sort of helped create a brand identity and a manifesto of sorts. It's used so much in our own projects that I feel like I'm creating that plywood waste in a way which I end up then using for experiments and for making products. And in a way, you could say that I did not choose the plywood consciously. It almost sort of chose me. So that's how it's been with material recently. A little more intense.
Interesting. Yeah, interesting. No, so when you said in the beginning that more of making, so is it sort of, if I have to draw an analogy, that typically when you start, you are more interested in like an immediate output, so you try and play around with that material, but eventually with time, with experience, you go so deep into understanding that material that then you uncover or explore like a more deeper layers of it to understand. Is that like a correct reading?
I think with plywood, if I was to take that example, the final products have almost been secondary in the kind of experiments that we've been doing. It's been more about understanding the material in greater detail and how to take those scrap pieces of plywood and stick them together, and what happens to the grain when you stick it in this way or that way, and then when you process it in a certain way. That the products have been not, I wouldn't say incidental, but they've been more kind of secondary to that process of understanding plywood in great detail. And I think that approach we've kind of carried forward to other material that we have then experimented with since plywood.
Got it. So I have like bunch of questions around that in the later part, but just to sort of have more introduction, is that why do you, or how do you see a designer knowing the material helps? Like how important it is for a designer to know his or her medium? Like that, what are you doing with plywood is in the follow-up one. But if you can again, as a introductions or a starter, is that what is rock paper scissors and why did you start it?
So like you mentioned in the introduction, it's basically a material laboratory. And I have an architecture and interior design studio in Bombay called Studio Tessera, and we started Rock Paper Scissors around 2018 alongside the architecture studio. We moved into a new studio space in Bandra, and we wanted to design a sort of collage of knobs on the main door. And quite a lot of plywood waste had been generated in the refurbishment of the new studio, and we sort of saw this waste and decided to make like a knob out of it. And so that was like the first kind of the first first kind of object that came that sort of led to the formation of rock paper scissors. And then that first experiment was very rewarding, and then we moved on to more ambitious objects and processes with the waste plywood. So, and since those first experiments, like plywood sort of became a gateway to other materials, and organically the design practice has developed a kind of workshop studio format in which the material lab setup sort of facilitates a deeper understanding of the materials that we are encountering in our larger practice. It also sort of allows hands-on experiments, and we are able to make small-scale objects in the lab, which really helps to satisfy our curiosity with the materials. So, of course, as architects, you are familiar with building materials, but this hands-on approach really provides an in-depth, understanding, I feel. Plus, these small scale objects, their lead times are much shorter as compared to the longer timelines that we encounter in architecture and interior design projects. They take much longer to complete. So that's very satisfying to be able to hold and test a finished product in those short durations of time. And that satisfaction comes, slower and fewer times with architecture, with bigger projects. So that's been a very, nice, rewarding thing from rock, paper, scissors. And another thing I feel is this kind of feedback loop that's created between the two scales, between the products that we are making at rock, paper, scissors and the projects that we are doing at Studio Tessera. The objects, they find a place in the projects, and the projects, they become sort of testing grounds for these materials and products, and hopefully they end up informing and improving each other. And like I was saying, with the idea of material, I'm realizing more and more that the best way or the most accessible way to talk about what you believe in, I think might be through, as designers, might be through this product or small scale. Because in these larger projects, there's a lot of, like erosion that happens because of, larger factors which are not maybe in your control, like your client or your budget or your BMC. And with smaller objects, there is much more control. So it sort of enables me to put out my, ideology, I think, more clearly, this lab. And it also, it makes me kind of fine tune it continuously in that process.
Quite interesting. And it sort of, the next question which I had was, actually you have answered it, but as in a sense that the ideology itself, like the material itself, should sort of project or demonstrate the ideology, and that becomes the core in the practice. But from your research on materials, I'm just breaking this question into two parts. Is that what are you trying to achieve, or is there an output while playing with this different materials, or is it sort of just exploration, or you want to see it fit in something? Is it guided by some constraint? Is it guided by some brief, or it's very open-ended kind of exploration?
I think it's a bit of all these things combined. We are definitely interested in understanding the materials in much more detail. So we are, constantly experimenting with the processes. We're tweaking or tweaking assemblies, or when we're working with things where there are ingredients involved, like concrete or resin experiments, we're kind of looking at what can happen at that level. And so, what are the breaking points of this material? How sustainable can it be? So all that definitely is very important. And so even our explorations, they range from like small isolated details to, like you said, like completed objects. So sometimes it might be an object that we're thinking of, and that might inform the way we are experimenting with the material. But at the same time, I think the use of these materials has become an experiment in kind of a more circular or sustainable design practice. I think this is because maybe our starting point was with the waste plywood material, and that sort of catapulted the whole process. So the way we choose to research and experiment with the materials, we are looking at sustainability, and we're looking at it in kind of two ways. Is what I've kind of understood is basically like we're looking at environmental impact as well as the idea of transformation by design. So what we've started as these modest experiments with upcycling the waste plywood from our own projects. I think we could potentially scale that up, and we are already in that process, by collecting waste from other sites, from fabricators, even plywood manufacturing units. And we're hoping, you're thinking that this acquisition of waste and processing then can be expanded to other materials, waste materials, coming out of construction sites. So that would be like that environmental impact. And the idea, of course, is then to take these materials and to explore various ways of processing them to add finesse and beauty to these materials, and create products which remove that association from waste. I think that's very critical, and that's what I mean by the idea of transformation by design. And what we're hoping to create is objects of desire almost, which are valued, and they are made out of waste, but they are valued so much, maybe hopefully, that they are passed on, and that in a sense also adds adds to their sustainability as upcycled objects.
Got it. But sorry to interrupt. यार ऐसा सवाल नहीं आता है क्या कि sort of ये क्यों कर रहे हैं? In a sense, I had the fortune to interview BV Doshi, lead BV Doshi, and where I asked him that has RCC sort of changed the landscape. To that he almost sort of in his style almost sort of told me कि यार नहीं, it's not like that. It is just a material. See Japan, how they have done. See other places. So don't blame the material, or don't even think about the material. It's finally what you create out of it, right? So, is there a tussle inside the studio? We are focusing on the material, but there is something. I mean, material is finally the means, right? For making something. So, what happens, or if you can just as a follow up one.
I don't know. I feel like materials, and this is a little bit new for me. Where as architects, you're always like your materials are very much a part of your practice. But for me, these kind of scale experiments are just like it's like a going into a mall almost. And like I have an interest because of now these experiments. I am like keenly interested in all sorts of materials. But like I mentioned, the choice of materials has become a little. I'm more sensitive to what I'm choosing to experiment with. But it is more about the material for me, if I'm to delve a little deeper, and then subsequently about what I am making with it. The opposite happens in the architecture practice, of course, but in the material lab, it's more, sometimes you're like we were making this ceramic mural for a project, and we decided to make like a miniature of that in terrazzo concrete tiles. So in that sense, that it was easy to translate that geometry with that material, and it was fun. But it was also about, I think at that point we wanted to experiment with concrete. We wanted to try to see how small we could go with it, and how we could shape it or form it, and with hands-on experiments. So even though we were looking at a ceramic, we decided to experiment that with that geometry with the concrete, the micro concrete. So I think it's a little more about the material than the final product. Maybe that will change going ahead. And with plywood, for sure, it's like Abhi, we have kind of mastered the act of like assembling the plywood and then turning it on the lathe. So what all can we make with it? That process is driving the experiments with material. It's not the vice versa yet.
Yeah. It's and as you mentioned, it started in 2018, more in a more focused, and I think like paying more attention to it. So yeah, it will sort of grow its organically as you value where it is coming from. On that note, in fact, I wanted to ask is like what are like are there any parameters or any framework or any guiding principles on which you evaluate material, or as you said, you are in a shopping mall, but sometimes you have a budget of, say, like like the money is the constraint, or certain things. So any guiding principles you guys have arrived at? I know you spoke about it in the beginning, which is sustainability, but any more nuances to it?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that there is obviously a you prefer certain materials to other materials as as a designer, but I wouldn't go so far as to say that one material is good or bad. But one way to evaluate materials, I think, is through what they call a life cycle assessment. So it's kind of, again, it's coming back to sustainability, but it's like the environmental impact the material has across the different stages of its life. So from growth, or the formation of the material, to its extraction, then how you're manufacturing it, then the transportation, then its usage, and of course its end of life stages. Like when and how it is thrown away. Can it be recycled? How does it degrade? So I mean, for example, like if you look at a material like wood, or say rosewood, you could consider it to be a sustainable material because it's a renewable material. It's biodegradable, and there is a large amount of carbon sequestration that happens during its lifetime. Sometimes couple of centuries. Plus, because these products that are made out of a rosewood, they are highly valued products. They have a long life, like instruments or furniture. They are, there's a lot of carbon offset that happens, and there's generally a embedded value of care and repair that is associated with these objects. So it's, plus it can be recycled or turned into biofuel. But of course, we know that there is a caveat, right? Like with rosewood, it's a rosewood extraction and logging is at a very high ecological cost. It causes like immense damage to habitat. These trees, these hardwood trees, they grow very slowly, but there is a huge demand in countries like China. And then I was reading recently that it's one of the most trafficked forms of flora fauna in the world ever. And so there's so much, there's even violence and social cost associated with rosewood extraction. So it's, what I'm trying to say is that there is no absolute measure for evaluating a material. There tend to be these contradictions that are there within even when you're looking at sustainable renewable materials, there will always be these kind of contradictions. So another way to evaluate materials could be more contextual and based on what leads the project. So it could be the physical properties of the material, like its, for example, its strength, or I mean, if you want an impermeable material or something, or it could be more nuanced, like socio-economic aspects, related to a particular time. Again, another example that I was reading about these transformer toys, the history of transformer toys, and what stood out to me was these tin toys which were manufactured in Japan in the years after World War II. So under US occupation, Japan was given the right to produce these tin toys, and interestingly, the material for these toys they found in these discarded tin cans that had been left behind at military US military bases, all those tomato and meat cans and all that. And these tin cans, they became like, they became instrumental in creating these really wonderful, in the typical Japanese style, these beautiful, unique toys with these sophisticated mechanics, that have become like these art objects now. And eventually the tin was kind of replaced by plastic, and there were other issues with it, which so it was no longer an ideal material. But in that post World War time, when Japan was reeling under economic distress, this discarded tin sort of provided this highly valuable material, right, which was abundant. It was easy to manipulate, and was able to create the socio-economic benefits. But again, like the rosewood, if you were to evaluate it under other parameters, tin might not score so well. It's like most metals, it's not the most sustainable to mine tin. It's non-renewable. Actually, tin is a relatively better material. But the point I'm trying to make is that there's always like these contradictions when you're evaluating a material. So I guess what these examples illustrate is that there are these set of lenses that you might have to use in order to say if a material is, to evaluate a material. And I guess as designers, we can only make informed choices. I think that becomes critical.
Correct. Absolutely. Yeah. I think, yes, there will always be trade-offs of what to use when. I think from after all these conversations with architects, recently with Vinu Daniel, long ago with Samip Padora, I think one safe bet is that वो local area में जो है in the radius of 10 to 15 kilometers, I think that's a safe bet where because udhar se hi source karo, and rest all is up to multiple other like con client and what's the budget. Yeah, interesting. And you have also engaged with repurposing, reusing waste. So any like if you can tell us like what's the dominant material that you have been using, is like I have a follow up on that, which is the most versatile material. But yeah, like any thoughts on plastic or your engagement with waste and any nuances or any learnings that you want to share with respect to repurposing and reusing? Yeah.
So plastics, we've experimented a little bit with acrylic waste that has come out of our sites, and we've tried to kind of apply it with the plywood and then turn it, and it had its there were some challenges because it's a smooth material, was as compared to plywood. But we've not really delved into plastics so much. We've gone into other materials, like we've worked with paper quite a bit. We've worked with resin to some extent, and concrete, and we're looking at glass now, like recycle, repurpose glass as well. And to answer your question about versatility, I guess it will obviously depend on the material, the properties of the material itself. But I think it also depends on who is working with the material and for what purpose they are using the material. So what I mean is that it'll depend on the properties or capacities of the material, but also on the knowledge system or the tools of the person who is using it. So is it a designer, or a scientist, or a chemist, or a craftsperson who is using the material? So what they're able to kind of do with the material then is very different. That changes. I think it also depends a little bit on what point of the life cycle of the material you interact with it. That has different affordances. Like if you're taking a virgin raw material, or you're taking it at some point of processing, after it's been processed to some degree, or like in the case of the plywood, you're kind of interacting with the material after it has become waste. That will also affect the versatility. And like I mentioned, the broader goals, I think, become very important. Like, are you trying to, like you were asking earlier, are you trying to just kind of play around with the material to push boundaries and see what's happening with which is something we are quite interested with, or are you looking to make a particular specific product, right? And then with a very specific function. So as a personally as a designer, I am engaging with plywood, like I said, at its waste stage, and I'm using woodworking tools to do this in a workshop, and I'm also using the lathe machine. And my aim is basically to push the boundaries of that plywood to some extent in terms of scale, smallness, and largeness. Um, and to try to create beauty out of a product, out of a material which is otherwise considered more utilitarian, or it's normally hidden. So I do find certain versatility in that plywood waste. It affords me certain control in the kind of projects that I use it in, and based on the toolkit I have. But a material scientist might approach the plywood waste in a very different way. They might pulverize it or make a pulp out of it, and then pour it into molds or something, and that versatility would be quite different. So I mean, I can talk about the work of the iconic practice of Neri Oxman, which she calls material ecology. She's kind of looking at making these biocomposites, right? And she's combining a whole bunch of disciplines to do this, from computational design to 3D printing with robots, and what is it called, synthetic biology, amongst other things. And she's working with a varied team of specialists, right, for this, like architects and biologists and zoologists, and depending on the project. And she's able to then hyper engineer these materials, which are originally synthesized in nature. So this Agua Hoya project that she has done, she's basically taken materials which are found in exoskeletons of insects and human bones or tree branches. These components, like the cellulose or pectin and things like that, and she's able to engineer it into a more versatile building materials, with which she's able to make architectural environments. And they've kind of experimented with a bunch of artifacts which are environmentally responsive. So we know that these materials in nature, they are quite versatile, because they are able to they point out that they are able to create a whole range of things in nature, which with different performances. But to take it and to synthesize it to create these man-made objects out of their natural materials, it requires a certain science, a certain environment, and a certain amount of research, and of course a certain intent. So what I'm trying to say is, basically, it's difficult, like the evaluation of material. I think it's difficult to pin down on the versatility. It really does depend on these different variables, or who's using the material and for what purpose. And of course, how the material is.
Correct. I think it's very fascinating, because it's a process, and you see it becoming something with your hands-on, sort of dabbling with it, and see it transforming with every experiment, with time passing by. So the follow-up one is, then how do you investigate, like, a short-term response of the material to what you're trying to do with it, versus like a long-term implication? Because long term could be like really long term, right? You can't really have, like, how will it react after 100 years, or how will it react after 50 years? So any thoughts there, if you can give an example, especially with plywood, um, My max interaction has been wo IKEA ke MDF is just like you can't reuse it again. Once you assemble a bed, you have to change your house. It's pretty much getting a new one. While every
Oh, wow.
IKEA says 10-year warranty.
Okay.
But so, like, how do you sort of investigate like a short-term impact or short-term response of the material or implications of that material versus long-term?
So I think here also this idea of life cycle sort of comes back, right? Like you have to assess the performance of a material. I think, like you're saying, the long term and the short term, it has to be judged over its life cycle. So some materials would have like a higher environmental cost in the beginning of their life cycle, like when you're extracting the material, it's like very energy intensive, or when you're manufacturing products out of it. Like for example, a good example is cast iron cookware. So it's very, we know it's energy intensive to make it, and even iron or like mining it causes quite a lot of emission. But in the long term, it's a highly durable material. It's those cast iron tawas, they are like passed on from
Hmm.
generation to generation. Like they are unbreakable. They can be repaired constantly. I mean, I personally like managed to remove the rust and make them usable again if they have gone bad. So they can be recycled again and again. There is also, I mean, generally it's a nice material because for cookware, because it's also, it adds value to the cooking process itself. So in the long term, it's able to offset some of the high environmental costs incurred in the beginning of its life cycle. So I feel
Hmm.
one sort of aspect is definitely like this MDF might not be the best material, in the sense that
Hmm.
how often can you repair the material? Is it possible to repair it? What is the amount of energy needed to kind of repair this material? So all this would kind of have an effect on the long term implications of the material. So
Hmm.
now kind of addressing the question for for the plywood products. Now plywood is manufactured in such a way that it's done to maximize the use of wood from a single log, right? It's like kind of made into these thin veneers, which are then applied together. They do this cross graining to add strength to it. The grain of the wood is turned up to 90 degrees to kind of add strength to it. Plus it's made from wood, right? So there's a lot of carbon sequestering that happens during the lifetime of the trees before they are converted into plywood. So it's relatively sustainable. But the glue they use to ply, it has formaldehyde in it, and most of the plywoods have uses glues. Some of them are now shifting to more eco-friendly glues. So it's not biodegradable, the formaldehyde, because of the glue. And of course, there is the usual your energy consumption in transportation in the processing of plywood. But in the long term, it's a strong and durable material, unlike some of these other engineered materials like MDF. And
Hmm.
it has a kind of a long lifespan, right? And it can be recycled. It can be recycled, and that elongates its life further. But unlike a material like rosewood, plywood is not usually associated with value or beauty. So it's commonly used in like shuttering for concrete. It's used in making temporary structures, or it's hidden in interior design. You end up kind of cladding it with other materials or painting it or something. So
Yeah.
if you want to add longer term value to plywood, especially to waste plywood, you want to try to make products which have some sort of an implicit beauty along with, say, the utility, and that kind of makes it more sustainable in a way. It expands its lifespan. And taking that thought forward, I feel like this idea of aesthetic or beauty, it sort of becomes a kind of survival mechanism or a sustainability mechanism for the material in a way, by fashioning these products. And it sort of encourages this stewardship, or it creates a value system where you want to repair this object because it's beautiful. You want to take care of it and elongate its life. Almost like you're creating an heirloom out of waste material. So that, I think, is a nice way to give long-term value to a material, and it's sort of been the brief for the recycle plywood project as well.
And when you say beauty, do you mean just? I have two questions actually. Just like double clicking on it.
I shouldn't
Like when
have
you
said
say,
beauty.
no. When you say beauty, in my mind it comes to like just applying a good veneer on top of plywood. Is that what you're pointing to, or just like
Not at all.
exposing the material and still sort of making or trying to give it an aesthetic sort of outlook, or yeah, just adding beauty as you said.
So it's interesting. We recently we exhibited in Baroda at Raw, and what was interesting was some of the reactions which we had not like. I wasn't aware, but a lot of people, designers and non-designers, they were very surprised to understand the provenance of the products that we had displayed. The plywood products that we had kind of put up, they were not able to understand that this was plywood. Because like you're saying, like plywood is not usually associated. We normally would put a veneer on it, or you would not kind of see it.
Correct.
So the idea has been, and I feel we have sort of succeeded in some way. I hope we have succeeded in some way in kind of making it beautiful by revealing that grain of plywood, and that comes from the specific way in which plywood is made. And so it's about kind of creating some intrigue and some beauty, and even of course your products have to be functional. They need to look beautiful as well, but the material kind of really aids in that. And if you can understand the material and the processes, then I think it adds to adding to the beauty or the aesthetic of the product. And you want to take care of it. You don't want to, just like you said, like with a bed, you don't want to just I don't know if it's going bad, the bed, or it's just you're done with it by the time you move to the next apartment. So
correct. Interesting. So Sagarika, and the double click, the second question which I was thinking is that how do you give shape, or like what's the story behind liquid plywood? I mean, you briefly spoke about it, but to me, I had long time ago, again, no more, but Aziz Kachwala, we also spoke about playing with materials, turning the wood. So how, like, what happens exactly? Like, I can imagine it iron, you're turning it and molding it with heat and stuff. Can you very quickly sort of share like what's the liquid plywood, or how does it come to be, or what happens, and why do you even call it liquid plywood?
The liquid plywood, because I feel like it looks quite fluid. What happens to the grains of plywood when you turn it on a lathe? So we use a lathe machine right now. Mostly we use a lathe machine. We also do some hand routing and hand carving. So I'll just rewind a little bit. So we were kind of inspired by these products that I had seen made out of recycled skateboard plywood, in which they use these. The skateboard plywood has colored veneers in it, and there were these kind of small, beautiful products that we saw, and we were kind of inspired by those. And we sort of took these small pieces of ply. Normally, the waste from sites is these thin strips that you get of different thicknesses and sizes, and we started to glue them together, but in a conscious way, because the way the ply is formed, right? I was explaining about the cross graining. So you get these kind of dark light patterns on the cross section of the ply, and then how you assemble those, that geometry kind of will create a certain pattern when you turn it on the lathe, or you process it on a CNC router, or you carve it. So that is mainly the process of understanding how that grain will behave when you start to ply. So we're kind of creating a new monolithic material from the waste that we are getting, and then processing it. And a lot of course, experiments and iterations were done to understand how that behavior will be. And the sizes, like I mentioned, of these scraps will determine कि क्या बनने वाला है, how are we going to assemble it. And we've looked at from small, what has been exciting is to kind of understand this new monolithic material and try to then make small objects. We're trying to make this like a small doll right now that I'm quite excited about, to something as big as we made a standing table recently for a wine shop. So, that those different scales with the same material, but you need to kind of tweak it based on what you're making and what waste you're getting as well. So each object is designed quite carefully, and for us, like it's become like a celebration of the anatomy of plywood, which is usually hidden, like we've been saying. So it sort of reveals that cross section. It's also kind of celebration of waste, right? Of the afterlife of material, and that satisfaction that you get from creating something which is functional, but it's still like inventive, right? By utilizing these.
Got it. I'll ask a very naive question, but when you said that you put it on like a lathe machine or something, does like this compressed plywood or whatever the plywood, is it that ductile or is it like malleable? How does it sort of, is it always shaved or it changes a little bit? It can hold a curve or something like that. I don't know whether it's a valid question also.
No, it's harder than wood to work on the lathe, harder than some woods. Like but it works like wood only. And because we did ply the acrylic with the plywood, so the acrylic and the plywood together also as a single monolith can be turned on the same machine and the same tools. We managed it to some degree. The only problem we were having was that the acrylic and the ply, after turning, it would keep on separating because of the smoothness. So we realized that we need to kind of reinforce that joint in some way. So it's a malleable material on a fast moving lathe machine, and the craftsman is required to kind of shape it then. And with a lathe, like with a potter's wheel, right? Like you get symmetrical objects, symmetrical along a single axis. But then you can further carve it. So you can really, based on what kind of object you want, it's like a solid material, it's like a new block of wood basically, and you can then process it the way you want to.
आना ही पड़ेगा, स्टूडियो आना पड़ेगा देखने के लिए. And like just last two questions, how like more of a application, or how is the outcome helping, how like these experiments definitely it takes you to a very micro level, but at a macro level, any examples of how these explorations are helping you in your commercial projects?
So I mean, like I mentioned, the architecture practice and the material lab are kind of functioning in tandem with each other. I mean, that's been the case, and with that studio workshop setup, and they sort of inform each other. So the materials that we are using in a larger practice they are being experimented in the lab, and the products that we are making, in the lab they find a place in the projects as well. But in a few projects that we've done, there has been a nice sense of satisfaction, because the waste that was generated in that project was reassembled and made into products and furniture, particularly for that same project, right? So it was really like creating a closed loop, where we put the waste from the site back into the site as a finished product. And because we were doing this with the plywood, we ended up kind of doing it with other materials as well, like broken pieces of stone and tile and wood. And we made like products and accessories and put it back on the site, because that ethos was then pervading the project in a general. So in that sense, it's been a nice kind of process, we are kind of keen to engage with the waste. It's made us very aware of those materials and how they are being used. And I feel that focus and detailing that we have, that is required to make these products in the lab, it sort of created a sensitivity towards materials in general. So we are much more conscious. I'm repeating myself, but we become much more conscious of what materials and how we are using. So that way it's been, and we're hoping to scale up with the products themselves. We're hoping, that there will be a demand for it, and start sourcing plywood from other sources as well, and not just rely on our sites, to sort of create networks where we can collect waste plywood from other sites and other fabricators, to kind of scale up the whole project itself.
So, what's the future of materials? I mean, yes, you'll be very optimistic about plywood, but generally, which material do you think will dominate in the market? And we can be bold to think of 50, 100 years out. We see a lot of sustainability brands. I think I had seen one talk somewhere where I forgot the name of the speaker, but she was talking about bringing more aesthetics to waste or upcycled materials, because generally we see them in a more rugged or whatever, a little, it has a different texture to it, and it doesn't give that royal or elite feeling of things. And so she was exploring on that front. But yeah, sustainability brands are also mushrooming. Do you think they will scale? What's the future of good materials? Any thoughts, or you guys have pondered upon it?
From this whole conversation and from what we are kind of been doing in rock paper scissors, also I feel that the future of materials lies in, I think, waste. Like you were also saying, sort of treating waste as a resource, and in a way like reclaiming materials from waste. And this is already a very positive trend, I think, which is, most designers are kind of buying into it, a lot of makers and even brands. So this seems to be the obvious way to move forward, because there's been an overconsumption of resources, and your traditional raw materials are they're getting exhausted, and they've become expensive, and in a way almost unethical to use in some cases, right? So waste is everywhere. It's inexpensive. There's a continuous supply of it. And for me personally also, I feel like it's an exciting material, because it requires a certain innovation, and experiment. And now I'm seeing that even collaboration, like when we go to sourcing a waste, when we need more plywood, when we need more raw material, in our case we'll need to kind of collaborate with other practices, makers, etc., to kind of source it. So it kind of, this opportunity to create something beautiful, which is made from something which is unappealing or discarded, I think it's highly satisfying. And the satisfaction is very different from making something out of a virgin material. So I think the future of materials, I think, would definitely be in like looking at waste as a resource. And for my practice, I'm really kind of excited to kind of look at a sort of grammar of collaboration again. And like I was mentioning, in the sourcing of material and the making of it. So I'm hoping to, we've started this already, but connect with other, even like larger plywood manufacturers or architects and designers and contractors, to start collecting the waste from them, and then in larger quantities, and see how we can process it. And this kind of method of sourcing or extracting the raw material, I think I'm quite excited to see where it goes. It's like a social way of getting your raw material, and I'm hoping it will help to create new relationship with designers and makers. We tend to function in bubbles. So I'm excited about this. And in general, I think it's about reducing the overall footprint of our design practice. That should be the future of materials.
Awesome. More power to you. And I think recently, even Modi, PM Modi wore a shirt or whatever, like some dress which was completely made from recycled thing and that was in the news. I think few big people doing something like this will hopefully transpire to masses and people will start knowing about it more. Cool. I think on this note, we can conclude this. Thanks a lot, Sagarika, for giving your time. It was wonderful chatting with you. Got to learn a lot of stuff. By the way, you didn't spoke about rock. I can sense scissors and paper. Is what any fun backstory of rock paper scissors? How the name came to be, or it was just
No, I think it's an appropriate name. I mean, I have because it's fun, right? It's a game, but the game is about material properties, right? Like what material trumps another material. It's related to how the material, like how rock, paper and scissors behave with respect to each other. So in that sense, and the permutation combinations that are possible. So in that sense, it's plus. I mean, it's catchy for branding.
Cool.
So
yeah, cool. So all the best and thanks a lot. It was great having you on the show.
Thank you. This has been fun. All right.
Super. Thanks. That's it.
And that's it from today's GAN session. For show notes and more GAN, visit audiogan.com. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at AudioGAN Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.